Alrighty guys, it is Qaaman here today, and in today's video we are going to discuss something that I saw a lot of you commenting on the last video where I talked about Toriyama being confirmed for Dragon Ball Super in 2023, and a lot of you guys were bringing up a very intriguing question about how exactly will Dragon Ball Super end, and I think that's a very interesting conversation that has a lot of different dynamics and directions that it can go into. So without wasting any more time, let's get straight into the video. So the first thing that we need to discuss is Uub. Now, obviously, Dragon Ball Super is kind of a weird series where it's like, it technically exists before the end of Z, but then like after the Buu Saga. So it's like a series within like another series, which is something very complicated because obviously it's not going to go into the route of Dragon Ball GT. I mean, GT is impossible because, I mean, it's a separate continuity, and the fact that the biggest difference is obviously even if GT were to theoretically exist, because the Pilaf gang in Dragon Ball Super is young and the Pilaf gang in Dragon Ball GT is old, that basically right there is already a huge contradiction. Also, I mean, there's so many other things we can add, like Kibito Kai and, you know, the Supreme Kai, or shall I say, like, Kibito and Supreme Kai not being fused together is another huge thing in GT. So all of those differences basically write GT out. But the interesting thing about GT, though, is the mere fact that the question will be, will Dragon Ball Super go into the time period that would have been Dragon Ball GT? So we're not saying will Super do the same things that GT did, but the specific time period that GT took place in, do you think Dragon Ball Super will ever go there? And that's a question for you guys. I think if we're being completely honest here, I think we kind of have to go in that direction, but it would be kind of weird for several different reasons. Because of Dragon Ball Super Superhero and the fact that Pan is getting closer to the age that she was near the end of Z, if Super is going to have a completely new anime that has brand new arcs that expand, you would have to think that at some point, for the continuity of the show, that you're going to have an arc that will include future events. But the question is that if we tie everything back to Uub, that means that Goku obviously wouldn't have any major threats that are attacking Earth that would cause him to not want to train Uub. Because if there was something really bad going on, Goku wouldn't have time to train Uub, and if he's willing to train somebody else instead of just himself, obviously, that means that he's probably mastered whatever he's been learning that we've seen in Dragon Ball Super. So for example, if Goku's going to train Uub, that probably means that he's already fully mastered Ultra Instinct by that point. And if you look at how calm the demeanor of Vegeta was at the end of Z2, if things are supposed to originally tie up, then that means that Vegeta probably mastered Ultra Ego, and Goku and Vegeta have essentially reached their peaks and see no real reason to, like, really push themselves the way that they did before. So Goku's next objective in life would be to try to train somebody else for the next generation of characters. All of that would make sense, but if all of that would make sense, that means that Super is going to go into a really peaceful direction. And we don't want to have a Boruto situation where we're going to try to make it seem like the next generation is more relevant. We want to keep it strictly to what we had in Dragon Ball Super. So this now brings up a bigger question. How will the show create tension moving forward? Well, I think the only way that we can do that is that we have to have a way where Dragon Ball Super literally never goes to the point where Goku eventually trains with Uub. And I think that what Dragon Ball Super also needs to do is maybe have the series end with Goku training with Uub. Because I literally think that if you try to go into that GT gap, you literally have to just completely retcon Dragon Ball Z. But now there's a problem with this. If you completely retcon Dragon Ball Z, that basically means that you're completely just changing the entire series again, and now people are going to say that GT, well, not GT, but Dragon Ball Super isn't canon. Because now, you're basically going to go into the GT time period, but then have totally different events, and have inconsistencies with the original Dragon Ball Z. So now, you literally will have 3 completely different series at this point, and Dragon Ball Z is basically going to be irrelevant, unless you look at Dragon Ball Z as its original canon. Super is going to be a completely different series with no continuity to Z anymore, if you start breaking those rules. And I really think this is important because obviously, if you know anything about the Dragon Ball community, if there's one obsession in this community, it's these canon debates of, oh, well, you know, this is canon because of this is canon because of that. But if you go into that arc and you want to make changes, man, there's no way that Super can tie up to Dragon Ball Z. And, you know, the reason why I mention all of this is that even if you go back to the end of Dragon Ball Z specifically, I mean, there's already some contradictions in Dragon Ball Super that basically write off Z too, because the one statement that really writes everything off is what Bulma said. If you guys remember when you see that scene where Goku and Goten were training, Bulma made a statement that she hadn't seen Goku in 5 years. Now, obviously, based off of Dragon Ball Super, that 5-year time skip is basically non-existent, because there's never been a point in Dragon Ball Super where we would have had a 5-year time skip of Goku never seeing Bulma. So that statement alone completely nullifies that and moves it into another direction, which ultimately brings up the question at hand in the video itself. How will Dragon Ball Super actually end now that we've brought up all of these talking points of how things can get retconned? Well, ultimately, guys, I think that Dragon Ball Super is going to have to completely slow down its pace. What it will do is it will probably just have the redone anime, or shall I say renewed anime, basically just focus on the arcs that we already had in the manga. That will basically last for a while, and then when it eventually wants to make new content, assuming that it does, original content that goes beyond that, what it will probably do is it will probably really slow down the amount of time before Pan eventually gets old enough to go into that world tournament with everybody else about a year later. Because if they do that, then they can have all of the events like crammed into a certain period. And if you go back to what Toriyama said, Toriyama actually made a statement a while ago, like several years ago when Super was coming out, that the reason why he chose the time period that he did for Dragon Ball Super is because he felt that everybody else would have been around their prime. So that means, at least in Toriyama's eyes, that he considers the end of Z to be a time period where people were somewhat leaving their primes, I guess you could say. And as a result of that, I ultimately think that that would be the healthiest direction for the show. But there are some problems that we still have to address, like Frieza. Well, does Frieza have to end up being dead? Because that's another thing. Obviously, you can try to wink it off and say that in the original end of Z, Frieza just wasn't ever mentioned again near the end of the series, but it's pretty obvious to the people who are watching the show that Frieza was intended to still be dead. And even though this was like an anime-only scene that was added in when like Goku was fighting against Kid Buu, you actually see Frieza in hell, like, observing the fight between Goku and Kid Buu. Granted, that was only in the anime. In the manga, you never got to see, like, all of those dead villains, like, having a discussion about Goku fighting a Kid Buu. That was strictly anime only, but you're gonna have to start answering a lot of questions of, do we tie Frieza up being dead again? How does Broly still exist in the universe? What about all these new characters that were never mentioned in the end of Z? You have to really tie up a lot of loose ends to make Z and Super fit into each other, which at this point, I think Super should just go in its own direction and just forget about what Z was, since it's already contradicted itself and Z multiple times. But overall, that's all I gotta say for today's video, guys. Please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe. And remember, as I always say, to have a great day, guys.